The young and the restless spoilers shocked Claire had been measuring herself against a shrinking horizon for months. With Kyle, what once felt like charm had hardened into expectation. He treated her patience like permission, and the small compromises she made each day stacked into a heavy silence she could no longer carry. She became the expert at reading the room before he entered it, trimming her sentences, smoothing her reactions, and pretending that the tension in her shoulders was just fatigue and not a warning. The version of happiness she'd been promised with him kept moving a few steps ahead, always out of reach. Holden slipped into her life without spectacle, and that's what made the difference. Nothing about him demanded translation. Conversation landed where it was meant to land. He asked and waited. He noticed and didn't pry, he laughed without making noise the point. A walk after work felt like oxygen. A late dinner tasted like permission to enjoy something uncomplicated. She could feel her instincts sharpening again, not to defend herself, but to pay attention to what she actually wanted. At first, Claire avoided naming it. Labels invited judgment, and judgment had always been Kyle's favorite sport. Still, the city began to notice what she refused to say out loud. There were sightings of her and Holden at the corner bistro with the soft lights, at a gallery opening where Holden let her look before he offered his take, and in a car with music low enough to hear each other think. The rhythm of those evenings recalibrated her week. She went home steadier, not giddy. That steadiness told its own truth. With Kyle, the opposite happened. The old choreography, his grievance, her explanation, his half-apology, their reset, stopped working. Every reset felt like being pushed back to the starting line of a race she hadn't agreed to run. He called it a rough patch and treated her boundaries like rumors he intended to disprove. He sensed change and mistook it for betrayal because the only constant he trusted was himself. The night everything broke open wasn't dramatic until the last 5 minutes. Rain had combed the streets clean. Holden drove her home because the day had been long and because the small kindness of not taking the late train mattered more than either of them wanted to admit. He walked her to the door out of habit, not performance. They said goodnight the easy way people do when there will be another. Then Kyle stepped out from the shadow of the awning, anger running ahead of him like weather. He demanded a story that made him comfortable. She gave him a simple one instead. Friends, she said. Nothing dramatic. The word friends was generous, and he knew it. He called generosity a lie and reached for the familiar script, the interrogation, the correction, the pity for himself he could pass off as love. When he lifted his hand, it was the gesture more than the force that told the truth. Loud, thoughtless, the kind of punctuation that expects a woman to flinch so the man can claim he never meant it. Claire did not flinch. She tipped the glass of water she was holding and sent it into his face. It wasn't vengeance, it was a circuit breaker. The street went silent. Holden took one step forward and stopped, because the choice belonged to Claire. She made it cleanly. She told Kyle they were done, not as a threat or a dare, but as a sentence that had finally completed itself. Breakups don't end with a single scene. They echo. In the days that followed, Claire felt the old habits tug. She almost texted him when she saw a headline he would have liked. She almost apologized for how public the moment at the door had become. She almost explained the difference between relief and cruelty to people who wanted drama more than clarity. Each time, she stopped. She had been living in almosts for too long. With Holden, she refused to swap one script for another. She did not make him a rescue, and he did not audition for the role. They kept their pace small and consistent. Coffee turned into brunch, which sometimes turned into a quiet afternoon with 2 books and 1 couch. They argued once about a promise made carelessly and fixed it by changing their behavior, not by ending the argument with a performance. They treated jealousy like information, not proof. They let solitude do its work. Kyle did not disappear. People like Kyle rarely do. He arrived at a mutual friend's birthday with apologies that sounded like poetry and conditions hidden under the rhyme. He sent messages that looked like questions but were actually orders. He asked for one more conversation and then another, hoping repetition could bluff its way into reversal. Claire met him in public spaces with clear endings. She spoke plainly and left before the conversation found another loop to live in. Cordial, not available. Honest, not cruel. Work steadied her. The version of Claire that returned to her desk belonged to herself again. She said yes without footnotes and no without panic. She noticed the meetings that fed her ideas rather than devouring her time. She apologized when she was wrong and stopped apologizing for having limits. The people around her adjusted. Most people do when the boundary is clear. There was one more fault line to cross, a charity gala that both she and Kyle were bound to attend. The room glittered in that tired way rooms do when they want to look like possibility. She and Holden arrived without ceremony, and if heads turned, that was the room's business, not theirs. Halfway through the evening, Kyle found her near the balcony. He had the look of a man who believed the night owed him a triumph. He spoke softly, the way people do when they want witnesses to think well of them. He talked about history as if it were debt and about love as if it were proof of endurance. Claire listened long enough to recognize the move. Then she answered the only way that wouldn't lie, to him or to herself. She said history was exactly what had taught her to leave, that endurance without joy is just slow erasure, and that love is not a license to ignore harm. She didn't ask him to understand. Understanding had never been the problem. The problem had been respect. Holden found her after, not to check or claim, but to ask if she wanted air. She did. They stepped outside into a night that didn't need their story to be louder than it was. They walked once around the block. She didn't narrate what had happened, and he didn't pretend to know. That quiet felt like trust. Over the next months, the city learned a new geometry. No more Claire who might come back if asked the right way. No more Holden as detour. No more Kyle as destiny. Claire chose her days, and her days chose her back. Friends stopped offering updates on Kyle once they realized she didn't confuse information with care. Gossip moved on to its next meal. It always does. The relationship with Holden didn't become perfect. It became honest. They missed each other occasionally for stupid reasons, fatigue, a misread text, an inside joke that landed wrong, and they fixed it by owning what was theirs. They made plans and canceled them when the week was long. They traveled once and discovered they were good at being lost together. They built the small rituals that real intimacy rests on, a playlist for drives, the kitchen light left on when one worked late, a shared note full of places they might go but didn't have to. If anyone asked whether she still loved Kyle in some corner of herself, Claire stopped pretending certainty would save her. She admitted that parts of her would always remember the early shine, the ways he made her feel seen before he tried to manage what he saw. Memory isn't a contract. It's a map of where not to live again. That admission didn't threaten what she had, it protected it. The final test arrived quietly. Kyle sent one last message, a long apology, the best he'd written, the most human, stripped of the theater. He didn't ask for anything. He just said he was learning. She believed him. She also understood that believing him didn't require returning to him. She wished him well and placed the message where it belonged, not in a drawer she'd have to reopen, but in the archive of lessons she had paid for in full. On a Sunday evening months later, rain starting again, Holden drove her home. The streets shone the way they had the night she ended one life and began another. He walked her to the door. They didn't rehearse gratitude, they felt it. Inside, she set a glass on the counter and laughed at nothing, the body's way of acknowledging safety. Her phone buzzed with a photo from a friend, the night sky over the river, a caption about how the city looks new after it's washed. Claire thought that was true of people, too. She didn't promise forever. She promised the next honest day, and then the next. Volume had once fooled her into thinking a story was big. Now she knew better. meaning is quieter. It sounds like the door locking behind you when the day is done, the kettle starting, someone you chose moving around your kitchen without taking anything from you can't afford to give. It sounds like a horizon that doesn't shift every time you step toward it. That was the change she wanted. That was the change she made. And in the steady music of it, the city finally stopped watching and let her live. Claire stood at the narrow edge between impulse and evidence, unwilling to let heartbreak masquerade as a plan and equally unwilling to let habit dress itself up as love. The question that circled her from every angle seemed simple from a distance: would she and Holden become a couple now that Kyle had revealed himself as a man who wanted loyalty without accountability, but simplicity dissolved the closer she looked. Holden carried warmth and steadiness that made ordinary hours feel breathable again, yet he also carried a history braided through Kane's orbit, a past with more corridors than windows. Kyle, for his part, had already announced the shape of his future by treating respect like a negotiable currency and remorse like performance art. Consequences were inevitable not because the world is fair but because character repeats until someone refuses to rehearse it. Claire knew she would have to be that someone. She would not step from one script into another just to stay on stage. She would step off, recalibrate, and choose on purpose. The city around her tried its usual choreography, advice offered as prophecy, nostalgia sold as certainty, the suggestion that safety lives in the most familiar hand even if that hand has recently closed into a fist. Victoria, practical to the bone and sharper than most at reading the currents that link personal choices to corporate weather, urged Claire to reconsider, pointing out that Kyle, for all his arrogance and missteps, was a known quantity whose flaws were already mapped and whose family alliances stitched him into a fabric that could be relied upon when storms broke. Holden, in contrast, was an unknown with a pleasant smile, a man off Kane's payroll who might be either the exception that redeems a resume or the example that proves why caution is a civic duty. Claire heard the logic and refused the conclusion. Known harm does not turn gentle because you can predict it. An unknown that agrees to be tested is not the same as a gamble, it is a hypothesis that rises or falls on evidence. She did not need permission to investigate her own future. So she made an inventory. First, the matter of respect. With Kyle, the ledger was crowded with moments where her boundaries had been translated into obstacles and her patience had been mistaken for consent. This was not a single scene or a single loss of temper, it was a pattern measurable across weeks and rooms and witnesses. With Holden, the ledger was incomplete rather than stained. Incompleteness is not innocence, but it is not guilt either. Second, the matter of loyalty. Kyle's version of loyalty demanded a loyalty back that looked suspiciously like silence. Holden's version, at least so far, sounded like attention and matched actions. Third, the matter of Kane, a gravity well strong enough to bend good judgment in anyone who drifted too close. If Holden had worked there, the question was not whether he had been near difficult choices but how he had behaved when those choices arrived and whether he had remained because it paid or because he had failed to see a door. She decided to stop speculating and start checking. The checking did not look glamorous. It looked like phone calls placed to people who did not owe her anything and therefore had no reason to lie. It looked like calendar pages compared to travel logs, like small discrepancies aligned until they revealed whether they were noise or signal. It looked like reading emails with her own name redacted and asking what tone remained once flattery was removed. She traced Holden's tenure under Kane through 3 critical months when a merger rumor became a hostile squeeze and then evaporated under scrutiny. During those months, Holden's name appeared not as the architect of pressure but as the person who moved numbers out of the blast radius to keep junior staff from being scapegoated when the maneuver failed. A second thread led to a vendor dispute that could have been weaponized. Instead, Holden had negotiated a release that cost Kane leverage but prevented a small firm from collapsing. A third thread was less clean. A late-night transfer that skirted ethics to buy Kane 48 hours of advantage. The transfer was reversed before it did damage, and the internal note attached to the reversal sounded like someone belatedly remembering the difference between clever and right. The pattern that emerged was human rather than heroic, someone who had learned in real time, sometimes too slowly, but whose errors tended to stop at the line of harm. Evidence does not absolve, it informs. Claire filed the information where it belonged, on the table, not under it. While she investigated, she recalibrated her distance. She refused the rush that so often wears the costume of romance and demanded a pace that allowed both feeling and fact to be visible at once. Where old reflex would have leaned into Holden's comfort as a shortcut through grief, she leaned into her solitude as a diagnostic tool. She noticed she slept without the old bracing. She noticed work returned her to herself rather than draining her reserves. She noticed that wanting someone felt different when need was not confusion in disguise. She allowed Holden into the perimeter of her days with clarity about the terms, radical honesty about Kane, no pretense that charm is character, no reward for evasions dressed as tact. If he was good, goodness would survive scrutiny. If he was not, the truth would arrive in time, and time was a landscape Claire knew how to walk. Kyle's consequences arrived in their own way, slowly and then all at once. The social version came first. Invitations that had once assumed his attendance began to ask whether his presence would be a benefit. Friends who had defended him out of habit found the habit too expensive to maintain. The professional version followed. A project slipped from his hands when a partner decided that volatility is a luxury only winners can afford, and he had not been winning. The personal version arrived in a quiet apartment that no longer reflected back the man he preferred to believe he was. None of this delighted Claire. Revenge is a poor diet. But neither did she intervene. Rescue had been the old choreography, and she had retired from it. He would meet himself without her as translator. Victoria's counsel did not vanish, it matured. After watching Claire's approach, methodical, unflinching, unseduced by either grand gestures or catastrophic narratives, Victoria shifted from prescription to observation. She pointed out that we reveal ourselves not just in crisis but in recovery, that Holden's readiness to place his past on the table without theatrics might tell her as much as the past itself, that Kyle's apologies, however eloquent, were still mostly weather rather than climate. She reminded Claire that choosing is not an exam one passes or fails once, it is a practice renewed daily. Claire appreciated the change in tone because it matched her own stance. People who respect you adjust when presented with new information. People who do not simply turn up the volume on their original point. Holden, for his part, met the moment without costume. He brought what he had done and failed to do and chose not to curate his history like a showroom. He named pressures without converting them into excuses. He admitted to moments where ambition outran ethics and showed the proof of how he had changed the slope since. He offered his resignation to any remaining ties with Kane before Claire asked, understanding that conflict of interest cannot coexist with trust. He accepted that her decision would take time and did not attempt to fill the space with charm, gifts, or manufactured crises designed to elicit proximity. Restraint is its own kind of respect. In that restraint, something sturdy began to assemble. It did not look like fireworks, it looked like reliability. It looked like days that ended where they were supposed to end and mornings that did not begin with triage. It looked like disagreements treated as maintenance rather than emergency, like apology defined as behavioral change instead of lyricism. It looked like Claire keeping her friendships intact and her ambitions audible, and Holden learning to be proud of a quiet integrity that did not require a difficult boss to look noble by comparison. The future did not snap into focus like a photograph, it developed in solution, emerging grain by grain until an image could be trusted. Would Holden and Claire become a couple? The honest answer was yes, but only in the way that mattered to Claire now. Not as a title adopted to soothe anxiety, but as a reality mirrored by daily evidence. The yes arrived on an ordinary afternoon that had no audience, when Claire realized she had not once edited herself around him in weeks and had not once needed him to be perfect to feel safe. She did not announce it, she lived it. And because she had chosen it after listening to the part of herself that refuses to be gaslit, the yes did not tremble when old ghosts knocked. Was she right to choose him over Kyle? The frame itself no longer fit. She had not chosen a man over a man, she had chosen a way of being over a way of disappearing. Kyle's betrayal had not been a single act but a philosophy of attention that placed Claire's dignity outside the budget. The results he faced were not punishments she designed but outcomes his choices seeded. If he changed, it would be because he finally preferred truth to posture, and if that happened, it would be good for him, not a reason for her to rewrite her life. As for Holden's past under Kane, vigilance did not end with a decision. Claire kept her instruments calibrated. She watched how he behaved when stress rose and opportunities appeared. She paid attention to who he became when no one was watching. She expected to be believed the first time she described harm and expected herself to believe him the first time he described his limits. Testing goodness is not the same as distrusting it, it is the way you honor it once found.